Hello everyone, today we talk about King Robert of Naples, one of the single most important monarchs of his time. This is the reason why probably this video will be extremely long. I'm contemplating now the idea of making it in two tranches because we made some videos about the Angevins of Sicily, eventually Naples after the Vespers, as you know, but this is such a big moment. I strongly advocated throughout all my Schwerpunkt experience for the realization that the peak of medieval civilization occurred between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century, and that essentially pop culture, aside from the general as continuous collapse of any social cultural standards, in even the last several years during Schwerpunkt's work, to unrelated things, hopefully we saved many people, admittedly, they said. But jokes aside, is completely oblivious of the fact, not just that this was, in fact, such important times, era, but it's properly essentially severed from the knowledge of the major historical figures of this very era. Robert of Anjou is definitely one of them, right? Robert, later known as Robert the Wise, King of Naples between 1309 and 1343, was the third surviving son of Charles II of Naples and Mary of Hungary, an Arpad princess, son of Stephen V and his Cuman bride, as a matter of fact. We're talking essentially the Capetians. Right, when we look about the Angevin kingdom of Naples, aside from the fact that the term Angevin, again, in pop culture revolves around just like the so-called English Angevins that were actually French in any case, but when, of course, the Capetians take over Anjou, and this also manages through at least political connections to dynastically expand into Provence, into Sicily, and become, together, in fact, with the same Capetian monarchy of France, the single most powerful and at some point probably richest country in medieval Europe at the time. Made an entire video about this. Well, magically, nobody cares about them. So, very interesting dynastic background. This was essentially Charles II, the son of Charles I. So, again, we're talking the same king of Louis the Ninth and the entire French royal line. Robert was born in the year 1278 within the fortified tower of St. Erasmus at St. Mary Capua Vetere, a small town near the ruins of ancient Capua. So we're in Campania. I will have to make a video about medieval Campania. I never made that except sort of as a whole throughout the entire millennium. This is largely going to be, not just, but of course the Angevin capital already at this point was Naples, right? Charles I had already established that, stripping Sicily of the centrality of the kingdom. Capua was the historic site of ancient Roman Capua. We'll talk about the Samnites soon at a point. We're talking already, again, Kingdom of Naples. The birth of Robert took place during a period of expansive yet fragile Angevin dominion over southern Italy, or better, right? This was, as we explained, the realm that Robert's grandfather Charles I of Anjou, founder of the same Angevin dynasty in what was at the time probably the entirety of the kingdom of Sicily, as the younger brother again of Saint Louis, had established just over a decade prior by conquering the realm from the Hohenstaufen claimant Manfred in the key Battle of Benevent that we'll have also to cover at some point, February 26, 1266. 2 years later, as you know, Conradin of Swabia descended into Italy and was defeated at the Battle of Tagliacozzo. Made an entire video about that, eventually captured on his way home as he was betrayed by some Latial noblemen and handed over to the Angevins, who decapitated him. Not even the papacy pushed that much for that. It was Charles of Anjou that really wanted to get it over with, the entire sort of Swabian legacy of the kingdom. I made some videos explaining the political institutional profile of Kingdom of Sicily and its sort of later split halves that continued with sort of the same a royal tradition, albeit as two different states, as you know, respectively by the Angevins and the Aragonese. Governing this kingdom alone was an enormous feat, right? It procured the Angevins an astronomical power, something that it's difficult, again, to picture until you quantify and realize, in this sense, that the Kingdom of Sicily alone had a greater income than the Kingdom of France at some point, right? So, and this under Charles I proper, not even saying relative terms before with other countries, but we'll have to tell a bit more that story. Then there are the Vespers that sever, in fact, the two realms in the Straits of Messina. In any case, still the most important part at this point is the Italian mainland, is what will become essentially more conventionally called the Kingdom of Naples. That is really a juggernaut of medieval monarchies. And that was incredibly complicated to manage because of certain interesting dynamics historically. The fact that the Normans had taken over the system and essentially feudalized it, but also maintained some of the important urban centers that'll be deprived of their communal development, unlike in central and northern Italy, could play a bit against the barons that had been further entrenching with all these dynastic changes versus the Swabians and the Angevins, all these wars, invasions, also from the papacy that had really eroded a bit the otherwise super state that the Normans and the Swabians in particular had managed to maintain, essentially the single most centralized of the Latin Germanic kingdoms in the Middle Ages. And at the time of Robert's birth, his father, Charles II, then bearing the title of Prince of Salerno, because he was not king yet, held an array of prestigious and far-reaching titles that underscore the dynasty's trans-regional ambitions. The southern Italian hinterland was incredibly rich in absolute terms. It wasn't qualitatively as developed as the center in the north already, but again, was simply massive. And so you as an Angevin king, you felt always like floating over this incredibly complex, stratified system that in some territorial parts was probably even out of reach, right? Areas like the Abruzzi hinterland and or even certain principalities like Taranto and the Duchy of Calabria. I made a video about Bohemond of Taranto explaining how sort of that principality had been not parceled out of the kingdom, but had gained historically a lot of autonomy, because at the end of the day it was enough to control the Neapolitan hinterland, especially the way, the roads towards Rome, and in this sense also playing a Mediterranean policy, attentively trying to reconquer Constantinople that had already been retaken by the Byzantines after the Fourth Crusade. The Sicilian Vespers essentially were sort of plotted by the Aragonese and the Byzantines to have Charles I abort his expedition to the Byzantine Empire that had no capacity to defend itself from an Angevin Neapolitan invasion. So you understand, it's a bit like when Henry VI died. Southern Italy was the launch pad for Constantinople. At that point, it was before the Fourth Crusade, but the Germans could have conquered Constantinople from there as opposed to the Venetians and the French. Now, these noblemen were incredibly powerful because they had this enormous amount of estates in the typically French, in this case, a bit more sort of Norman, southern Italian feudal style, large estates straddling literally an enormous territory stretching in fact from the Channel to Greece. We also made some videos about, for example, the Battle of Pelagonia. We've seen how at that point actually Manfred of Sicily is interfering in Balkan. So at this point, when you look at the peak of medieval civilization, realize that the axis constituted by this great Guelph alliance of the Kingdom of France, the papacy, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Guelph, the Italian Guelphs in central and northern Italy were by far the most disproportionately rich, advanced, civilized, educated, bureaucratically administered, militarily advanced, commercially affluent, and artistically prolific, and more juridically organized, theologically pioneering part of the continent, disproportionately so, because, say, France and Italy summed, like, at that point, the wealth hegemony was almost complete in central northern Italy. We're talking a good half of the entire Europe was contained, right, in terms of manpower and resources in this enormous wealth papal French dominion. It was something utterly immense. It's basically the single most important thing that happened statally wise in sort of in terms of sheer absolute concentrated power in medieval Europe, except, again, nobody kind of tells you, also because the idea that, of course, different peoples, countries, etc., could constitute a continuum, and even being able to quarrel with one another within it, but still presenting some sort of solid front against the Ghibelline imperial enemies, is something that I know by fact, it's not being told you, not in extremely approximate and sort of incredibly narrow terms corresponding to the sort of practically absolute ignorance that, again, pop culture demonstrates in this kind of topics. This is again, we will see now that how the age of Robert was properly the peak of all this. Charles, so Robert's father, held this array of prestigious, far-reaching titles, we're saying, that underscored that the Angevin dynasty trans-regional ambitions. He was the designated future king of Naples and Sicily, technically, because this happened before the Vespers. When Robert was born, the two parts were still united. And even later, when it was lost, like, technically, the Angevins claimed still the kingship of Naples, such as, later also the kingdom of Jerusalem. So it's a bit complicated, but we will get, if anything, on Schwerpunkt to that at some point. He was also Count of Anjou and Maine, Count of Provence and Forcalquier, Prince of Taranto, King of Albania, Prince of Achaia. So as he became also the ruler, in fact, as he was elected to the Neapolitan throne, Achaia was the Frankish principality, as you know, in the Peloponnese, established after the Fourth Crusade, and titular king of Jerusalem, as we were hinting at. Now, these holdings extended Angevin influence from the continental French territories through the Italian Mezzogiorno as far as Malta, encompassing significant portions of Piedmont in the north, because there was the Seneschal of Provence that had been conferred properly because the Angevins also were counts of Provence. That was, interestingly enough, also a Holy Roman Imperial subject, right? There were very interesting connections at this point also with Rudolf of Habsburg and some potential marriages even between the Angevins and the Habsburgs, even though they had sort of been enemies, like Ottokar II of Bohemia, the great enemy of Rudolf, was allied with Charles I, right? There were some German veterans of Tagliacozzo who fought at Markfeld, right? That happened exactly 10 years later. In any case, there was this other enormous theater that was, again, central northern Italy, which, as you know, especially since the time of the Swabians, historically, the Holy Roman Empire, different Transalpine rulers had attempted to hegemonize, right, with various degrees of success. In any case, never sort of full grip on it. And actually, in Angevin times, and I made also a video about the Thalia military system, the Guelph party, so the pro-papal one is sort of therefore pro-French and sponsorized one, was almost completely hegemonic, and this marked a moment of great economic expansion. When you look at it from a Ghibelline perspective, you realize that it's a bit like because, as you know, also from the end of the 13th century, the economy starts sort of gradually stagnating, and then in the first decades of the 14th century, there is the pre-crisis phases. So it's actually an incredibly similar period to our own, right, in terms of civilizational struggle, and all this sort of victory of the popular element of the commerces. It's sort of the more republican view held by the Guelphs, ironically and non-ironically, also because essentially they were sponsored by single most monarchic powers out there, the most functional monarchic powers, but they were also the more republican among the Italian communal one, right, by standard. So it's a very interesting melange. Well, the Ghibellines were seeking, from a new Germanic, at least, ruler to descend from, I say Germanic in a Holy Roman Imperial sense, because eventually you get Henry VII of Luxembourg, that was essentially a Francophone, a Lorrainese, to drive the a Reconquista, sort of. And this is what will partially happen, in fact, at the detriment also of the Angevin dominion at this point, right? But as we observed also in the video about the Talia system, the Angevin rule over central northern Italy was not, first of all, a real rule. The Italian city-states essentially ruled themselves by themselves, right? The Angevins renounced to attempt to simply crush them, to use an iron fist on them, like the Germans had historically tried to do, or also Manfred from the same Sicily that had, as we've seen also in the videos about Montaperti and also different Catholics of the history of Florence, had almost succeeded in. However, the Guelphs had finally triumphed because of the Angevin crusade that the Pope launched against the Swabians in southern Italy. All documented. If you're interested in that, I have plenty of videos on that, and this is kind of an evergreen. It's again, one of the single most important times in medieval Europe by far, right? I can't really see another horizon that corresponds to this, especially in absolute terms. And so you have a very interesting set of stability, trade, commerce is going smoothly, an enormous European interconnection, all under the Angevin edges that asked just for sort of modest amount of money to garrison some Neapolitan, Provençal, depends, like French knights in this or that Italian city, some even Almogalvares from the actual former enemies from the Vespers wars that remaining without job were hired by the Angevins. Some others instead, like Roger de Flor, went over to, as you know, Romania for another story. I made videos also about that. There is all the phase of Charles I, Charles II. It's very interesting to browse, very brutal, as a matter of fact. But today we talk about Robert, right? So there was this notion of maintaining nominal sovereignty over the remnants of the Latin kingdom in the Holy Land, because still technically at this point it would have been feasible, especially up to the Vespers, for the French to reconquer not just the Latin Empire, but also to expand further. Louis IX, after all, had almost succeeded in that, hadn't he died in Tunisia? So lots of what-ifs that, as you have probably understood by now, I'm also not too thrilled by, because I prefer to look at how history happened and why, all right? The Crusader states were lost in 1291. I made a video about the Siege of Acre explaining that partially entwines with the story of Roger de Flor, essentially a failed Templar that sort of exploited the situation to profit a little bit. So quite intricate, complex. Robert's mother, Mary, brought, as we were saying, royal Hungarian blood to the union with Charles II as the daughter of King Stephen V of Hungary and Elizabeth the Cuman, thereby making young Robert the nephew also of King Ladislaus IV of Hungary, and embedding the Angevins within a crucial network of Central European dynastic alliances. In fact, as you know, the Angevins in the 14th century, I made a video about 14th century Hungary, will rise to the Magyar throne, as much as they will actually also to the Polish one, as the Piasts extinguished themselves in this before the Jagiellonians came in from Lithuania. Now, as the third male child in the family, preceded by his elder brothers Charles Martel, born in 1271, and Louis, born in 1274, Robert's initial prospects as a younger son appeared decidedly subordinate, governed as they were by the rigid principles of primogeniture that typically reserve the throne for the eldest surviving male heir. We also know very well, especially looking at these biographies, that being born at the time was a Russian roulette, especially as far as infancy, partly also in adolescence, in terms of survival to an adult age, even for this most traumatically elite, hyper, most powerful people in the world. So things could change. In any case, you had to be ready, fit for kind of adventures and more. The Angevin clan was fairly close-knit, aside from the later civil wars that in fact followed to Robert's, also as we'll see now, family tragedies, sort of lack of a heir, there's a male heir. And initially, also here, the dramatic upheavals triggered by the Sicilian Vespers revolts really shattered the Angevin house. As we know, the Vespers were this great anti-Angevin uprising of 1282 that permanently split the kingdom. This and other dynamics would soon dramatically alter Robert's trajectory, elevating a once obscure, relatively obscure cadet to the very pinnacle of Angevin power. All the eyes of Europe were placed on these individuals, regardless of the order of inheritance, so to say, of the throne. Now, the Sicilian Vespers revolt was one of the most pivotal events in medieval Italian history. It erupted violently on the evening of Easter Monday, March the 30th, 1282, in the bustling streets of Palermo, the capital of the island of Sicily and former center, in fact, of the broader kingdom. What began as a seemingly minor altercation between French soldiers and local Sicilian youths, at least according to legend, quickly escalated into a full-scale popular uprising against Angevin rule. Fueled by long-simmering grievances over Charles I's oppressive taxation policies, because Sicily really went under a severe crisis under the Angevins, differently from the southern Italian mainland. Also, cultural impositions favoring French settlers and the ruthless elimination of native Sicilian elites following the 1266 conquest. All right, really what triggered the revolt, that in the Risorgimento was mostly painted as a sort of Sicilian popular movement, etc., was a very carefully coordinated international agreement between the Sicilian barons that in any case controlled from the hinterland this great, let's say, the insular cities. They were a bit like also in southern Italian mainland, big markets, right? They were really big cities, but they had not evolved into city-states or anything, because this was largely a feudal monarchy. Like there were baronial powers, especially in the hinterland, controlling everything. These guys allied themselves with the Aragonese, that were also the rising naval power in the Western Mediterranean, and the Byzantines, the Palaiologoi of Constantinople. So within hours, the Angevin garrison in Palermo was systematically massacred, and the rebels swiftly proclaimed their allegiance to Peter III of Aragon. Right, he was the king of Aragon between 1276 and 1285, husband of Constance, the last Hohenstaufen heiress. Right, Constance was the daughter of Manfred, and thus carried Hohenstaufen legitimacy. Again, if you don't know what Manfred of Sicily was, like, just know that it's highly unlikely that you can claim any sort of medieval historical knowledge whatsoever. She had, she had gone over to Spain after marriage. She was buried in Barcelona, if I'm not wrong. It's a beautiful tomb of hers. And this conferred, it's still the age of the great imperial universal ambitions, and the Spanish had believed in that, partly also with Alfonso X, that had, as you know, mingled in sort of German affairs, even though he never went over to Central Europe, unlike the brother of Henry III, and as they were sort of kind of both kings of the Romans during the great interregnum. The Vespers insurrection spread like wildfire across Sicily, effectively expelling the Angevins from the island and transferring control to the Aragonese crown by the summer of 1282. Years ago, I made an entire series about the various dominations of medieval Sicily, so we have seen this passage. Again, you have the Byzantines. Before that, actually, I didn't make it, but of course, there were the Ostrogoths even before the Vandals. Then you have the Byzantines, then the Arabs, then the Normans, then the Swabians, then the Angevins, and then the Aragonese. And when you study the history of the Kingdom of Sicily under the Aragonese, you realize that even though this was sort of conquered by the Aragonese, these kingdoms, as also the later Kingdom of Naples, Aragonese Kingdom of Naples in the 15th century, operated as autonomous vice royalties of some sort. They were essentially kingdoms on their own. At some point, the Aragonese kingdom of Sicily was antagonistic, even with the same Aragon in Catalonia. They were quite autonomous, and at this point understood mostly as lands of conquest. The great medieval civilization was coming to a level of exhaustion where everybody would seize whatever. In fact, Aragonese Sicily wasn't this dramatic explosion of of welfare, right? Sicily had truly been the beating heart of the Mediterranean under the Swabians, even the Normans. But now it was really collapsing. And again, it would be interesting to digress on the social dimension of this, but we've seen it in the videos about Aragonese, Sicily, and beyond. Here we're talking about the other side, what was happening across the straits, because the cataclysmic event of the Vespers permanently bifurcated the once unified kingdom of Sicily. The island became the kingdom of Sicily from this side of the lighthouse, meaning the one of Messina. So the insular kingdom, later called the kingdom of Trinacria under Aragonese rule, while Charles I at that point retained the mainland territories as the kingdom of Sicily beyond the lighthouse, so the continental kingdom of Naples. It was, again, by far the most powerful. All right, but the capacity, as we will see now, reconquering Sicily, in spite of the staggering efforts, will elude it. All right, because Sicily is also pretty big, and again, you don't simply take over it. If there isn't a complacent establishment like it has happened with the Vespers, that basically install like a new government, making the rest of the business running as always practically. It's a bit difficult to simply impose yourself. The Angevins will, again, devastate Sicily with their invasions, but they will ultimately not be able to subdue it. Very precarious situation in any case. This was also a cumbersome geographic distinction that belied the profound territorial amputation suffered by the Angevin dynasty. You literally had these, say, twin neighboring hostile power looming over you. Again, the Sicilians could not conquer Naples at this point, nor ever. It would take probably the full might of the Aragonese and actually the Milanese support later in the 15th century. However, they could launch raids. Right, this is a bit the context in which Roger de Flor rises. Piracy, trade, etc. Made lots of videos about him in this context. That is quite fascinating, because some barons, say, I don't know, in Calabria, would just have their own estates, would sort of sell their products, but at the same time carry out piracy and still be kind of vassals of the kingdom of Naples. And so, again, incredibly important, also fairly well documented reality, but a difficult one, right? Because at some point, especially the Tyrrhenian coast was devastated by the Aragonese. You can't quite control in the Middle Ages like an entire coastline. This would be later a problem. It will develop also an important level of infrastructure, especially by the time of the Ottoman raids, as we've seen also in Renaissance naval warfare. The ensuing War of the Sicilian Vespers, because the dances had just begun, the protracted clash lasting 2 decades, in fact, an entire generation, defined the contour of Robert's early childhood and reshaped the Angevin realm irreparably. The war's immediate consequences were devastating for the royal family. On June 5th, 1284, during the naval battle of Naples, Charles II was captured by the formidable Aragonese Admiral Roger of Lauria, the greatest admiral in medieval warfare, and surely sort of originally in Angevin service before defecting, commander of the Sicilian Aragonese fleet. In fact, at that point, less than a year later, on January the 7th, 1285, Charles I himself succumbed to illness while campaigning near Foggia. Charles I, so his father himself, because he was still the king of Naples, of Sicily actually, but de facto at this point already, just of the southern part, succumbed to illness while campaigning near Foggia. In the attempt of taming the various revolts, again, this southern Italian mainland was enormous, was vast, was incredibly complex. There would be many baronial issues. He died in this campaign, bequeathing a throne and chaos to his imprisoned son amid a military stalemate. And so, to protect the vulnerable royal children that were now deprived of the most important members of their family, and from the escalating perils of the war, the 4-year-old Robert was dispatched along with his brothers Louis, aged 10, and the infant Raymond Berengar to the relative safety of Provence. The Angevin county in southeastern France centered on Aix and Marseille. We are in 1282. They will remain there under strict guard until 1288. This was definitely a good preemptive measure considering what would in fact happen to their ancestors. And this exile provided temporary respite, but the greater trials lay ahead. In diplomatic maneuver aimed at securing Charles II's release, the Treaty of Canfranc, this was an 1888 treaty in the Pyrenees, was negotiated and signed on October 28, 1288, between Charles II and Alfonso III of Aragon, who was king of the Iberian monarchy, the Aragonese Iberian monarchy between 1285 and 1291. And under its terms, Charles II would regain his freedom in exchange for delivering 3 of his sons as political hostages to Catalan custody. Robert, now aged 10, Louis XIV, and Raymond Berengar, 8, who joined his brothers in March 1289. Transported to imposing Aragonese strongholds in Catalonia, the young princes endured a grueling 7-year period of confinement that profoundly shaped their formative years and left an indelible mark on their personalities. Basically, they manned up in this prison. During this extended captivity, the brothers' education was meticulously entrusted to Franciscan friars, the rising sort of educational institution together with the Dominicans. These were the members of the Order of Friar Minor, founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209, made countless videos, not just on St. Francis, but properly the legacy that he had left politically, spiritually, religiously, inasmuch as the friars minor were essentially backing from their urban activity also this enormous Franco-Papal alliance system and rising to the top educational levels in Europe, right? They became great university scholars. The Franciscan friars provided a rigorous program emphasizing moral discipline, intellectual cultivation, and spiritual depth as well, right? The Franciscans were essentially modeled in practical organizational terms on the Dominicans that were almost sort of militarized, a bit like the later Jesuits of Ignazio of Loyola. They were, however, a bit more spiritually vibrant, although in this sense a bit heterodox. At least there were some scandals along the way, and by this time they had been normalized, but they had sort of procured some headaches, both the papacy, like the Sorbonne, the top theological faculty in the West. In any case, the instruction, you understand, these orders were universal, so they responded to the papacy. So obviously, also in Aragon, they existed. There was nothing contentious about their allegiance. The instruction was what mattered really, and this was particularly influenced by the Catalan spiritual Franciscan Peter Escarrer, a devoted disciple of the influential theologian Peter of John Olivi, a Provençal Franciscan whose rigorous views on poverty provoked fierce controversy. They imparted to the princes the austere and demanding ideals of evangelical poverty, apostolic perfection, and communal simplicity. This pedagogical environment forged lasting bonds between the Angevins and the Franciscan order, especially its more radical spiritual wing, the one that sort of caused more problems. They had historically insisted on absolute poverty and clashed with popes for this, advocating a strict adherence to what they deemed to be the original interpretation of and motivation of Saint Francis, even beyond his eventually modified rule, as you know, by papal request. Now, the ordeal of imprisonment had transformative effects. For Robert, it nurtured his burgeoning cultural and intellectual ambitions, while deepening a lifelong devotion to Franciscan spirituality that would characterize his later reign. You can debate also how this was in line with their sort of more chivalric, knightly, and also imperial ambitions, particularly the French at this point. They had virtually substituted themselves to the Germans, in at least as the greatest power in Europe. But there would be standards profoundly held at that level of courtly life that these positions entailed in any case. But it's interesting how, in fact, in the age of scholastics, the future king of Naples would receive this very specific sort of view on the world. Louis was the most profoundly affected, by the way, fully embracing the monastic vocation, entering the Franciscan order in 1296 and serving as Bishop of Toulouse. There's a very famous painting by Simone Martini depicting the bishop who would become saint, by the way, yet another Saint Louis of the Capetian house, blessing, in fact, a Robert that kneels in front of it. So that's a very, of course, ecclesiastical, iconographic propaganda apparatus in the work, and it really shows how important historically the connections with not just the Angevins, but in general with the Kingdom of Sicily, with southern Italy, the popes had. Like, since Norman times, as you know, the southern kingdom was explicitly a feudal vassal of the pope, right, outside of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. And in this sense, having a condition of power sharing in terms of ecclesiastical administration. The church, up to the Italian unification, had an enormous power in southern Italy, and the Angevins at this point were fully embracing that, right? The Bishop of Toulouse, by the way, Louis passed away in 1297. He achieved canonization 20 years later. Raymond Berengar likewise pursued a clerical career. This is, again, extremely interesting also from a psychological point of view, like being literally sent as hostages over to a foreign court, right, after the humiliation that their country had suffered at war. Isolated from the outside world, yet intellectually enriched, and that's where probably where these youth found their sort of escape in those years. The brothers emerged from captivity not merely resilient, but indelibly molded by contemplative values that stood in stark contrast, however, to the martial and political exigencies of Angevin kingship. In other words, they had missed part of the knightly upbringing. The year 1295 brought seismic shifts to the Angevin succession, thrusting Robert into the role of heir apparent. Charles Martel, titular king of Hungary through his mother's claim, who had been designated successor and actively associated in governance since Charles II's release from captivity, died prematurely in August 1295 at Naples, aged just 24, from an illness contracted during a diplomatic mission to Hungary. Dramatically enough, he left behind a single son, Charles Carobert, born in 1288, that, as you know, will inherit the Hungarian claims through his grandmother Mary of Hungary, claims that, again, would be realized when the boy ascended as Charles I of Hungary, founder of the Carobertian branch of the Angevins in Hungary in 1308. Again, we covered this in the videos about Hungarian history. With Charles Martel's untimely death and Louis's forthcoming renunciation of worldly titles in favor of his religious vocation, Robert's path to the throne of Naples cleared dramatically. On February the 13th, 1296, Charles II formally elevated him to the position of Viceroy General of the realm, which is a good way to associate your son to the throne to facilitate the succession, also to make an international statement about this. Also, Robert was made Duke of Calabria. This was the traditional title of the Neapolitan heir apparent, just like the Prince of Wales for the King of England. The long-standing appanage reserved for the crown prince. The Duchy of Calabria wasn't the most powerful. Taranto was actually more powerful, so sort of state within state, but still, right? And there will be important princes of Taranto under Robert's rule. Now, in a coordinated effort, the universities and representative bodies of the realm petitioned Pope Boniface VIII that regardless of, that avalanche of garbage on YouTube, like who was the most evil pope or whatever, was actually one of the most stellarly exceptional popes in the history of the church, reigning between 1294 and 1303, architect of papal theocracy and author of the bull Unam Sanctam, right, who duly ratified Robert's designation as heir on February the 24th, 1297, explicitly prioritized the political necessities of stable governance over strict application of primogeniture. Right, really have to do something about Boniface VIII, Philip IV of France, because otherwise you don't even understand this history. Here we're narrowing it down essentially to the Neapolitan affairs, but it's all one with France, with Rome. Well, this will be a bit more evident also as far as the rest of Italy is concerned. Also the Mediterranean from Naples. However, it's part of this gigantic axis that is literally mastering Europe at this point. Now, the Pope searched obviously for stability. Even when quarreling with the King of France, the Papal and French forces cooperated in various military theaters, etc. Now, the decision of rising Robert to the vice kingship of his father was later vigorously defended also by leading jurists such as Bartholomew of Capua, the Angevin logothete and chief ideologue, who argued its legitimacy on grounds of dynastic expediency and papal overlordship. The Angevins inherited from the Swabians a very important as autonomous juridical tradition in southern Italy, especially from the University of Naples. I also made a video about that at some point for our series about medieval law. Nevertheless, Robert's accession to power ignited enduring controversy. For example, the Hungarian branch of the Angevins branded it an outright usurpation, and the poet Dante Alighieri, Florence's exiled Guelph poet, that at that point in fact had been expelled from his mother city as he had opposed the Black Guelph, so basically the most pro-papal, pro-Angevin side. In fact, the Angevins had notoriously sent a military force to expel those white Guelphs from Florence, together with Dante, author of the Divine Comedy, immortalized the grievance in the opening lines of Purgatorio 9:1-2-3, decrying the inganni, that is to say, the deceits perpetrated against the lineage of Charles Martel. Baseless rumors circulated of fratricide or coercion to force Louise's abdication, but these accusations lacked any evidentiary foundation and gradually dissipated in the face of pragmatic necessity. Right? There was no valid reason at this point to sabotage the unity of the Kingdom of Sicily, that, by the way, was very useful for many other powers involved, and just by itself was a powerhouse of splendor, force, and magnitudinal reach. Robert, now fully committed, assumed extensive collaborative responsibilities, assisting his father in both the day-to-day administration of the realm and the ongoing military campaigns across its most volatile frontier regions. To solidify the fragile Aragonese alliance and advance the prospects of Sicilian reconquest, Robert entered into a strategically arranged marriage on March the 23rd, 1297, in Rome. His bride was Yolanda, also known as Violante in Italian, of Aragon, daughter of King Peter III, and the Saint Constance of Hohenstaufen, the niece of the illustrious Emperor Frederick II. So you understand how a beautiful entanglement, how much blood, right, running in these veins from celestial royalty, right? In all this, even the Angevin legacy was, in a sense, overshadowed by the historical splendor, regardless of political factionalism, ideologism, pure public communication, of Frederick II. Right, Holy Roman Emperor, 1220, 1250, the last, the greatest Hohenstaufen ruler. that, as you know, was also known as Puer Apulia because he really preferred really much more southern Italy to rule from than the same much beloved Germany, as a matter of fact, as well. By the way, Constance was also sister to King Alfonso III and James II of Aragon, who would rule it. James II ruled Aragon between 1291 and 1327. I made a video about him. Briefly, he was also in control of Sardinia. We'll partially see it later. She was also sister to King Frederick III of Sicily. So the guys who were fighting, we were in Sicily at that point, struggling against the Angevins. He ruled between 1296 and 1337. There was a defiant younger brother, for which Sicily was fitting. And the revered Saint Elizabeth of Portugal, Queen Consort of Portugal, canonized in 1625. The union between Robert and Yolanda was explicitly designed to facilitate the recovery of Sicily, as James II pledged substantial military assistance against his own brother Frederick. This is what we were saying before. The same Aragonese Catalans would go against Sicily at this point, even though they were literally the same dynastic blood. Frederick, in fact, had brazenly defied the 1295 Treaty of Anagni. This was, a town where the papal broker treaty had meant to restore Sicily to the Angevins, under which Sicily was to be ceded back to Charles II by securing acclamation as King of Sicily by the island's barons on January the 15th, 1296. Naturally, none of this had happened. Robert's territorial endowments were progressively expanded to match his elevated status. He was appointed vicar in Sicily on June the 24th, 1299. Remember, he's not king yet, right? Or at least he's vice-roi, right? He was granted the Principality of Salerno. It was a rich mainland province. On May the 5th, 1304, and he was awarded the County of Piedmont as well, the strategic alpine foothill area linking Provence and Lombardy, amidst, by the way, quite brutal clashes there with the resurging Visconti dynasty that was, however, taken out at 1302, just to be reinstalled later by the Luxembourgs. It's not like Robert was dramatically involved in these affairs. He wasn't much, again, of a fighter, right? But he was very well sort of brought. But the concession of Piedmont was happening on February 17, 1309. So he started to manage, again, an incredibly complex dominion, unlike even probably the greatest monarchs of Europe normally could. These strategic assignments placed him at the forefront of the realm's most contested frontiers. It seems good for the heir to the throne to still demonstrate in this still very martially French chivalric knightly culture that there is some strategic understanding. These frontier lands included the St. Calabria, which posited Robert directly confronting Aragonese Sicily. Piedmont, as we've seen, in the midst of ongoing reconquest force from Ghibelline lords, so the pro-imperial Italian factions, where Robert did demonstrate a remarkable proficiency in balancing routine administrative duties with the demands of political military operations as well. And we're talking big military operations, at least by this provincial standard. Military hostilities against the Aragonese Sicilian forces reignited with renewed intensity in 1299. Serving as Duke of Calabria, Robert took personal command of the Angevin armies, leading a coordinated offensive that captured the key port of Catania. So they crossed the strait to get this major sort of eastern Sicilian city, market city fundamentally, and laid siege to the fortified city of Messina itself. the northeastern Sicilian stronghold guarding the strait, in conjunction, by the way, with his brother Philip of Taranto, prince of the eponymous city and later of Achaia. Frederick III of Sicily responded with devastating counteroffensives. At the Battle of Falconara near Trapani, where probably on the opposite end of Sicily in the west, far west, in 1299, Philip crushingly routed the Angevin forces, personally capturing Philip and shattering the siege of Messina. Pope Boniface VIII intervened decisively in 1300 by summoning reinforcements from the Templars, the Knights Templars, the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, and the reluctant Genoese Republic, the maritime center that was at this point aligned with the Welsh, but of course wanted to not to spend too much. This is also the year of the Jubilee, so there is some broader spiritual emphasis, which culminates in a resounding naval victory for Roger of Lauria's fleet over the Sicilians on June the 14th, 1300. We're talking about Pons at this point. He was from the side of the Angevins. Despite these gains, the campaign ground into a costly stalemate, because as we've seen also in different medieval and ancient naval warfare, fleets were essentially necessary to supply land armies, and especially here in a coastal situation, also across the straits and so on. You fought just like the first planes, World War One. Like fighters were born just because planes had been born just to spy on the enemy's trenches. Then they increased in number, they increased in quality, and began to shoot at one another. So the galleys, in a sense, performed that, but without land forces, of course, like they wouldn't work by themselves. Besides, both sides were really exhausted. In a bid to break the deadlock, King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, reigning between 1285-1314, dispatched his brother Charles of Valois, titular, by the way, Latin Emperor of Constantinople, even though, again, the Byzantium was under the Paleolithic at this point, with a large expeditionary force in May 1302. Valois' army ravaged the Sicilian countryside as far as Sciacca, but was soon decimated by malaria and the relentless harassment of Frederick's troops, prompting negotiations that produced the Peace of Caltabellotta. This was the definitive peace treaty of August 31st of the same year that would basically put an end to the so-called Wars of the Vespers that had lasted literally 20 years, almost uninterruptedly. Again, war will actually continue, but for a while there would be longer periods of inactivity from both sides. Under the terms of this peace, Frederick III retained Sicily for his lifetime, even with a promise of posthumous restitution to the Angevins. His descendants would hold the island as vassals under the title of Counts of Malta as well. So, pretty ambiguous situation. This treaty essentially has definitively confined the Angevins to the Italian mainland, stabilizing their rule, but at the irreversible cost of the island kingdom. Yolanda's sudden death in August 1302, most likely from the plague that ravaged the region, necessitated a swift diplomatic remarriage. On June the 21st, 1304, Robert wed Sancha of Majorca, pious daughter of the king of the island, daughter of, in fact, Saint James II, ruler of the Balearic Kingdom and Montpellier. We'll talk about this politics because, we didn't talk so much about island powers. We have to talk about Sardinia as well. Never made a video about that alone, for example. But the Balearic Islands are also sort of underappreciated in their strategic relevance. Her mother was Esclarmonde of Foix. She was essentially a French noblewoman that also was famous because she became a devout Franciscan tertiary whose piety mirrored Robert's own inclinations. So his mother-in-law here had some connection with the marriage. This, however, turned out to be a childless union. It allowed to strategically ally the Angevins with a cadet branch of the Aragonese house, providing a counterweight to Sicilian power from within the broader Catalan sphere, at least. From his first marriage, Robert had fathered two sons, Charles, the future Duke of Calabria, who died in 1328. So as heir apparent to the throne up to that point, he was born in 1298 and destined to become probably also the Duke since the beginning. And Louis, born in 1300 at Catania. So during the very expeditions there in Sicily, this is very interesting, the fact that when these kings moved, they brought together the whole court as long as it was safe. Louis tragically died young in 1310. Now, these heirs provided essential dynastic security during the early years of Robert's reign. But as you understand, later on things got dark. In the wake of the Caltabellotta settlement, Robert redirected Angevin energies towards consolidating influence in central and northern Italy, where there was really a lot of money to harvest. Appointed Captain General of the Guelph League, that is the pro-papal party in Italian politics, by Boniface VIII himself in 1304, Robert launched a major campaign into Tuscany. Right? A central Italian region dominated by major Guelph powers like Florence and Siena, and that, however, harbored different Ghibelline regimes. Where in the spring of 1305, Robert commanded a mixed force of Catalan Aragonese knights under the seasoned Captain Diego de la Rat and a robust infantry contingent. Yes, as we said before, especially after the Peace of Caltabellotta, there were lots of Catalans who served in the Angevin army of Naples and were sent also as garrisons in different Guelph Italian centers. On May the 20th, 1305, Robert's army surrounded the White Guelph stronghold of Pistoia. The White Guelphs, I shall make a better video explain sort of these political lines, were de facto crypto-Ghibellines, right? There is no such a thing like, first of all, a well-outlined Guelph doctrine. Like the Ghibellines had something going with sort of the imperial Catholic tradition in a more at least imperially impositive fashion over the papacy for different reasons. We will talk about that. You can imagine how like the Guelph, especially the White Guelph, would have even less of a doctrine. The fact that Dante was a White Guelph and that everybody says, but because the White Guelphs were not just like the Black Guelphs, and so people assume that there is something doctrinal behind that it is equal to no, right? These were essentially crypto-Ghibellines, if not fully fledged Ghibellines, just like Dante, as a matter of fact. But they had successfully been infesting Tuscany, Emilia. There were some important cities that had turned White Guelph and thus de facto Ghibelline or something similar. There were some Ghibelline powers that were also hostile to some of these cities. We have recently seen the case of Bologna, for example. At this point was White Guelph, but also came back a bit like in the ranks of Black Guelphism. Pistoia was a fractious Tuscan commune between essentially Florence and Lucca, and so it was a small city, but it held its ground, or interestingly enough. Robert's army poised for assault, but the election of Pope Clement V, the first Avignon Pope, who reigned between 1305 and 1314, on June the 5th, 1305, this was a Gascon with leanings towards neutrality in the broader international scene, halted this operation, forcing a reluctant withdrawal. If I'm not wrong, I made a video about the siege of Pistoia back in the day, so you can check that out, and we will surely cover Pistoia in our historical regional series for the Italian communes. Minor commune, but say relatively minor, but definitely important bit as a tip of the balance at this point. Now, from 1305 to 1306, Robert served as vicar general in Provence, adeptly managing the county's vital economic and diplomatic interests. Between July 1306 and May 1308, he assumed full regency of the mainland kingdom during Charles II's prolonged absences, gaining invaluable experience in sovereign governance. So you go a bit to Occitania, you sort of control things there, because in any case, yes, Provence is yours, but there's also the rest of France in the west that is aligned with you. Very commercially thriving area. Then you go back to Naples. You understand how at this point he was really substantially educated in both political and military matters, And again, Naples, this immense kingdom, and also with the enormous fast of the court under the Vesuvius, literally, was a matter of unmitigated prestige and sort of experienced donor, so to say. Robert also played an active role alongside his father in the intricate negotiations at Perugia, the Umbrian city. We made a video about it in 1305, that led to Clement V's election, right? So they were incredibly complicated. We never really made a papal biography, but we'll see how they were entwined with some of the most intricate political issues of the era, clientele, so these communal histories with one another. That's why you must study them. The same Boniface VIII was very much into this stuff. Charles II's death on May the 5th, 1309 at Naples marked the culmination of Robert's long apprenticeship. Without hesitation, he proclaimed himself on the same day as Dei Gratia Rex Jerusalem et Sicilia. So it's interesting, of course, that the Kingdom of Jerusalem comes before, even the Sicilian one, that, as we've seen, is also kind of Helvant, but it's recognized as always the Kingdom of Sicily. Remember that. Ducatus Apuliae et Principatus Capus, the Duchy of Apulia and Principality of Capua, Provincia et Forcalchieri ac Piedmontis Comes. So the Count of Provence and Forcalquier, as well as Piedmont. Pope Clement V formally crowned Robert in a lavish ceremony on August 3rd, 1309, in the Cathedral of Avignon. That was just newly the papal see on the Rhone. This was a massive display of power, a sort of granitic reaffirmation, so to say, of the Franco-Papal alliance, emphasizing Robert's sacral role as the lex animata, so the living law of the church, in the full sort of scholastic sort of metaphysical explanation of the era, guarantor of peace in Italy, and functional equivalent to the emperor in papal territories. The latter is particularly relevant because, as we've seen also in the reign of Boniface VIII, the papacy had claimed properly the empire and the Caesarian title for the same pontiffs. And in any case, at that point, things were to put themselves once again in motion because, as you know, here there is Henry VII's expedition, and so lots of problems for the Angevins that risked really. Many people say, oh well, but you know, Henry VII arrived in Italy and changed nothing. It actually changed a huge deal, right? And we will see now how and why. Now, the Avignon Rite, infused with theocratic symbolism, launched a reign of nearly 34 years that brought unprecedented stability to the Angevin realm compared to the turbulent eras of his father and grandfather. That's why Robert, in many ways, is also considered this great last word, this peak of civilization, embodying this great papal French tradition, the full affirmation of this Angevin power at the expense of the Swabian one in southern Italy and beyond. Robert's rule amplified Charles II's administrative reforms. As we've seen, he was known as the wise again, so he was very well educated, he was sort of well acquainted with both the theory and the practice of government by that point. Robert was a bit of a spiritual figure, right, in many ways, not just because of his education, but in many ways because of his temperament. Robert was ideally a bit like the Solomon of the era, a bit like his great uncle, Louis IX, who was not just a saint, unlike Robert. He wasn't canonized or in the hour of that, but let's say, as you know, Louis IX was literally called in every single kingdom to resolve disputes legally. I mean, the French, together again with the papacy, with Italy, were properly leading the most sophisticatedly advanced juridical theories of and practice of the era. Robert thus fostered a golden age of cultural and intellectual patronage. The Italian Trecento is living through also the Angevin court at every level of artistry, right? Literary, statuary, pictorially, architecturally, and more Boccaccio's, Martini, and so on. Robert politically asserted wealth hegemony across the Italian peninsula and pursued, though ultimately in vain, the elusive goal of Sicilian reconquest. There was really this sort of much just few to actually succeed in, but that sort of brought in part to the exhaustion of both kingdoms. And as you know, at the end of his reign in the 40s, with the universal crisis of the mid-14th century, brought about many changes also in the kingdom of Naples. At the ideological core of Robert's monarchy lay a sophisticated fusion of Thomistic scholasticism, so the theology of Thomas Aquinas, Dionysian hierarchical order derived, at least Dionysian meant from the writings of the pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. We've seen this also in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, or at least, that's always the same reference. And so there is a big deal of French mystique in this monarchic view, and in fact also uncompromising papal theocratic bond here. This can show you how a properly aligned power, like it's not like the papacy at some point hadn't had problems with the Angevins. They were very powerful, very close to Rome. At some point, the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg was brokered together with probably this new papal sort of pro-imperial attitude, at least mildly so, in a quite delicate balance after the fall of Manfred, the arrival of the Angevins. But this, again, was a power that nor with the papacy nor with the Italians really went pretty hard, right? There was a great deal of sort of stability provided by the new connection with France and beyond, and also just a more advanced civilization, telling you the truth, that allowed, in terms of broader political alignment, for this, again, incredibly prosperous moment. And it makes you really think, because this would be amazing in some video to discuss from a strictly ideological point of view. In this wealth-gibbeling struggle, it would turn out to be mostly consumed in central northern Italy, but with an enormous deal of Neapolitan support under Robert, to especially stiffen like the wealth resistance that at some point was almost to be crushed by the gibbeling comeback. Like what kind of ideals and values correspond historically to, like, in terms of those who win and those who lose. And you understand that sort of with the shrinking of medieval civilization, mid-14th century, everybody lost. We've seen it also well in the video about Ludwig of Wittelsbach, that, as you know, was essentially protecting William of Ockham, Marcellus of Padua, so probably the secularists viewers of the empire, something, again, just a decade after Dante, and just like with a completely different post-traditional mentality by those times standards, all right? Robert rejected the same Holy Roman Empire, at least in a strictly German sense, as a historical sopruso, that is to say, an usurpation antithetical to natural law, viewing the res publica Christiana as the exclusive domain of the Pope, with temporal rulers like himself tasked with ensuring political unity in service of the divine plan. Naturally, Robert wielded an incredibly powerful French base, so to say, the Neapolitan one itself. And he was, in many ways, the man who kept the papacy protected, so he wasn't a mere subject of the papacy. But ideologically, that's what they had to go by to essentially appease, at least in ideological terms, the papacy that wouldn't be able to fully impose this on practically anyone, but it was at least sort of spread further through, again, this as we've seen, universitary teachings, scholastics, the general political propaganda of the era. Well, in a moment, as we'll see now, which the emperor also came back, and so the Angevins themselves had all the interest of putting forward this idea, because in any case things were changing. So there was, say, if there hadn't been an emperor, it's not like the Pope would have actually been the leader of this world, and this was part of a recognition of spiritual superiority as opposed to secular capacity. All right, even though things dangerously overlapped from both sides, as we were saying, with Philip IV and Boniface VIII, these are literally the same years, and so that's the paradox. So be always careful to just understand this stuff in merely ideological terms, because that's not how, at least the practice of politics in parallel worked, and the papacy was perfectly aware of that. But there was, again, an harmonious coexistence, especially with Robert, right? Problems would come mostly from the Guelph front at the end of the period, but we will see it now. Now, as papal vicar of the empire in Italy, literally, right, from 1314 until his death, Robert exercised the imperial prerogatives without any obligation of fealty, promoting a vision of governance as, quote, unification in diversity, unifying in diversity across the patchwork of Italian communes. Also here, the Angevins did not really have any specific reason to impose themselves on Italian communes, because keeping the route open between France and Italy through the Rhone, still fueling the Champagne fairs in North Italy, was the normal thing, right? For the Germans, it was different. The Germans were more bellicose, were more truly imperialist in view, and they quite surely necessitated to military conquer these city-states. The Angevins could simply do that by sheer sort of hegemony, by sheer adherence, etc. And in any case, they wouldn't control either the Italian city-states, because the sheer level of manpower and material in central and northern Italy at this point was something utterly shocking, right? Milan was richer alone than the Kingdom of England. Then the papacy came after the same English. First had been historically Sicily, now Naples, and in between Sicily and Naples, France. So you understand where probably the balance of Europe laid in financial terms, and also just in manpower, in military force. In fact, it's not random that the Visconti in Milan became the greatest power capable of tendentially hegemonizing central northern Italy in the rest of the 14th century. In the series I made about the Italian communes, you see all of this unfolding. You see all the various phases, first the Swabian wars of the Lombard League, and then this clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, Charles of Anjou, Henry VII, and beyond, right? That opens your mind about medieval warfare. If you don't pass through those cities, you will never understand what was going on internationally, right? Which is the other mistake that people tend to make so easily. And you immediately understand where a person hasn't studied those pages of history, because they get the whole thing all wrong in perspective. Frequently likened to King Solomon, as we were saying, for his wisdom, Robert disseminated knowledge through that aforementioned Dionysian hierarchy of courtly and ecclesiastical officials. This anti-imperial doctrine, meticulously articulated by his chief minister, we named him before, Bartholomew of Capua, justified Angevin military campaigns against Ghibelline lords as holy wars in defense of the church. I also made a video about John the 22nd's crusade against Milan in 1321-22, also against the Dulcinians, and again, that's a good video to understand also what the papacy was doing, but really must make a video about the Avignon papacy. Personally devout Robert and Sancha, so king and queen, emulated Christ through acts of charity and piety, endowing the Grand Franciscan convent of St. Clare in Naples, a great Franciscan church and royal mausoleum, by the way, one of the most famous churches, not the most, in Naples, from 1310 onward, and immersing court life in a blend of devotional rigor, chivalric courtesy, and regal splendor. The magnificent Angevin Bible, commissioned around 1340 and illuminated by the artist Cristoforo Orimina, exemplifies this synthesis, intertwining sacred texts with lectures, illustrations that proclaim dynastic legitimacy and pious kingship. I used some of these beautiful pictures for the images here. Robert's intellectual prowess was extraordinary, proverbial for the time, described by contemporaries as deeply learned really in holy theology and expert in moral philosophy and logic. The Angevin king maintained a vast royal library, enriched with translations from Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew sources, including works by the Dionysius the Areopagite, Averroes, like Ibn Rushd, the great Islamic commentator on Aristotle. That is essentially what came to the West in that mutated form, the same Aristotelian works that were being put together. Like Robert had a corpus of Aristotle summarized for him by the Franciscan James of Alexandria. So lots of things going on. Imagine just it's fantastic. Like the idea of, again, there were lots of grievous events, as we've seen, lots of wars, but just imagine living in Naples just like that in your castle. Like, it's freaking amazing. He engaged Jewish scholars for exegetical insights and fostered an entourage of translators as well. Robert authored 2 significant theological treatises himself. The first, in 1323, addressed evangelical poverty, mediating between Pope John XXII, incredibly important Avignon Pope between 1316 and 1334, and the radical spiritual Franciscans. The second, composed in 1332 and revised for Benedict II, Pope between 1334 and 1342 in 1335, vigorously defending the doctrine of immediate beatific vision against the Pope's controversial deferral to the Last Judgment. This is very interesting because it underscores Robert's ecclesiastical education, de facto, in his youth. So a man of enormous knowledge, learning. Most remarkably, over 280 lay sermons survived from Robert's reign. Delivered in scholastic style at universities, abbeys, diplomatic summits, religious feasts, and even the nuns of St. Clare, representing a unique corpus of medieval royal preaching. Though derided by Dante as the king of sermons, literally re da sermone, in the Florentines' work in Purgatorio 8, 147, for prioritizing rhetoric over action, the imperial Ghibelline tradition there was very felt in the Alighieri. These texts served as powerful instruments for mobilizing intellectual and spiritual resources in support of the monarchy as well. And there is, in fact, a bit of a paradox that the Guelphs are really a bit sort of less effective than the Ghibellines at war. There are, as we'll see now, lots of things really going wrong, including the Battle of Montecatini, the largest battle of the era in Europe, that witnessed also to the death of the Prince of Taranto. You'll see it later. The Guelphs are, however, incredibly good defenders. Florence alone withstands alone with all the Guelph allies, the siege by Henry VII. It said that the largest army ever was something like between 60 and 100,000, even though we can reasonably at least dismiss the higher end. But in a sense, it's because so many people came to Florence, and Florence already was sort of pretty big and could sustain with all this enormous help, because the siege was ineffective because Henry VII couldn't even surround the city, so it was replenished, and many reinforcements could arrive, and the emperor had to depart. But that was also happening because of a great Neapolitan support under Robert. And at the end of the day, salvaging this, especially central southern Italian reality, essentially central Italy remained a bit more Guelph, whereas the north was almost completely recompacted by Henry VII under the Ghibellines. And we made multiple videos on Milan, on Verona, that sort of show that pretty well. There's a lot of warfare, really a lot of warfare. The Angevins could mobilize, however, also some of the finest feudal cavalry out there, from the Neapolitan barons, the Provençal ones as well, and beyond. Were also probably French mercenaries at this point were typical for the Guelph side, especially after Montecatini. The Catalan infantry was completely dismissed, because it was practically good for nothing. Like the Amogalvares were great in the Eastern Mediterranean. Anything in Italy, they are completely, ineffective. Heavy cavalry, Germans, French the Italians also seek after next to their own. At that point, incredibly advanced armed forces. There was magnificent integration, also foreign elements under a strict status control. Robert's mecenatism thus was a way to gain further power and wealth, elevating Naples to a preeminent center of proto-Renaissance culture. His Neapolitan court integrated jurists from the local university, founded, as we were saying before, by Frederick II in 1224, and refounded by Charles II, the Studium Generale, with mendicant convents and vibrant literati from central Italian communes that were explosively thriving in practically any level of civilizational output, creating an osmosis of legal, theological, and artistic energies. The same Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, father of humanism, dedicated his epic Africa to Robert and traveled to Naples in 1341 specifically to undergo examination by the king before receiving his poetic laureation on the Capitoline Hill. Right? That's how important Robert's insight, wisdom words really were for this higher sort of level of lyrical achievement. Giotto di Bondone, right, pivotal Florentine painter, initiator of naturalistic art. Again, we don't make much history of art in Schwerpunkt, but at some point a good video on Giotto is warranted, right? At the king's invitation, adorned Castel Nuovo, the main royal palace in Naples, and the church of St. Clair with frescoes, of which only fragments now survive, unfortunately, while Simone Martinis, the Sienese master, other giant of European art of the time, 1317 altarpiece in Naples depicts the aforementioned Saint Louis of Toulouse crowning his brother Robert, symbolizing divine endorsement of Angevin rule. You really want to appreciate, I made a video years ago about properly the Italian Trecento at this point, so the connection between Naples, Tuscany, Avignon, and so on. Because all these figures, as you know, Petrarch, he will have a future as an imperial ambassador, as a papal one. He stayed at Avignon lots of times. So there was always this French-Italian connection within the Guelph, even though sort of things had gone a bit more diluted in ideological counterposition between the two parts. But here, Giotto from Florence, Simone Martini from Siena, these are inexorably black Guelph centers and incredibly powerful ones. I made, of course, a pretty nutritious amount of videos on them. They reflect this unavoidable Angevin connection. Tino di Camagliano, another Sienese sculptor, crafted the tomb for Robert's son Charles of Calabria. Right, that masterpiece. Judah ben Moses Romano and a host of Umbrian Tuscan artists enriched the court with sculptures, manuscripts, and paintings. Southern Italy was a crossroad of the Mediterranean, and very much like the most prolific center, the court, like at this point, in also broader artistic, cultural terms. So still, there was an important legacy of the previous Sicilian kingdom. There you find, again, these, as you've seen, translators, Jews, like also from really non-European works. Through such patronage, the Angevin support propelled proto-humanistic currents, integrating communal elites into the regime and positing Naples as a beacon for scholars and artists across Italy. Religiously, Robert actively promoted the canonization of saints tied to his dynasty, leveraging them for propagandistic ends. Of course, he spearheaded the cult of his brother Saint Louis of Toulouse, canonized on April the 17th, 1317. We were saying before, collaborating closely with the Franciscans and Guelph allies to disseminate sermons and relics that validated Robert's own legitimacy through Louis's voluntary renunciation of the throne. There's a massive level of oral propaganda, which we obviously don't document, but at the time was so very important in a culture that at this point was really in between, sort of the more classical medieval period and the more secularly, sort of modernly diluted later one. The highest level of sophistication, really. In tandem with the Dominicans, or the order of preachers founded by St. Dominic, Robert orchestrated the canonization of the same Thomas Aquinas. That was native to the same kingdom, by the way. That was an important town between Rome and Naples. We are on July the 18th, 1323. So you understand how spiritually framed, like, the entire political architecture of Robert really was. The king personally preached at the Avignon consistory before Pope John the 22nd. So there was an aura of sanctity recognized by the same church due to the full obedience to the same, and also wielding this disproportionate amount of power. things were very complicated internationally. Again, we will see it better in other videos, but already this one gives you an idea of what more or less like the magnitude. What I would like to leave you with here was the universal scope of this Neapolitan monarchy that, again, I don't see any video about, unfortunately, on YouTube, and especially in such a dramatically prosperous time like the one of Robert. Now, the aforementioned saints fortified the same Angevin regime. The Aquinas provided Thomistic underpinnings for the same Neapolitan governance and sort of beyond for the entire Western Europe, while Louis crowned the dynastic tradition of holiness alongside great uncle Saint Louis the Ninth of France and the Hungarian forebears introduced by Queen Mary. In fact, it was also Elizabeth of Hungary, that story from the previous century we covered partly in the video about medieval Thuringia if you're interested. In any case, Robert aligned with Michael of Cesennas, Minister General of the Franciscans, 1328 vision of authentic Franciscan observance, supporting the order's universal mission without endorsing the eschatological extremism of Joachimites, the followers of Joachim of Fiore, that was also native to Calabria, that, as you know, was this hermit sort of mystic of the 13th century that had prophesied lots of things, applied mostly or misapplied also to Frederick II as the Antichrist. It's all the apocalyptic ideas. At the same Fraticelli, so-called little friars, radical dissident spirituals that were exterminated actually by the papacy at that point, together with the Dulcinians under John the 22nd. Hence, those videos I made. One is the legacy of Francis, I think it's told. The other is, again, the papal intransigence. You can easily find them. They tell you really very interesting things about this period. Now, Robert extended patronage to all mendicant orders and the secular clergy, securing their ideological and material backing that, as we explained, especially in southern Italy, was enormous. The diocesan power within the kingdom, as you know, there were probably even papal enclaves like Benevent, technically belonged to the papal states, was not even Kingdom of Naples since Norman times. Now, in 1333, through the Franciscan envoy Roger Garini, Robert negotiated with the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Baybars al-Yashankir, later al-Nazir Muhammad, to secure, because we don't know fully, to secure rights for the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land to officiate at the Cenacle and Holy Sepulchre. This partly echoed the Frederick II Al-Kamil deal, but under a completely different circumstance. As titular King of Jerusalem, Robert in fact sustained a Franciscan presence in the Levant that, as you know, was a thing since St. Francis's participation to the Crusade and the likely sort of meeting with the Sultan, though his crusading initiatives remained largely rhetorical and under-resourced, if anything, because of the enormous amount of resources necessary to reattempt the conquest of Sicily was kind of a precondition for the crusade, right? The same Louis IX basically died in Tunisia because his brother did not want him to come to Sicily because he didn't want to pay for it, and that's a disaster they created. Hadn't been for that, likely Egypt would have fallen, Jerusalem would have been reconquered. There was planes. It was not just about the French. There were monster contingents by the Aragonese, by the English. As you know, Edward I, we've seen him. It was the only ruler at that point went on with a crusade and got almost killed by the assassins in the Holy Land. But it's very interesting. And again, we curated very much Edward I Longshanks sort of series because it's one of my favorite rulers. Now, administratively, Robert built upon and surpassed Charles II's reformist foundations, achieving greater efficiency through a specialized central bureaucracy anchored in his stable residence at Naples. There was no doubt about the centrality of the city. It was certainly, again, one of these big coastal markets. Ancient Naples was one dating back to the Hellenic colonization of southern Italy, and that had gained prominence in Swabia, and particularly now Angevin times. Charles I decided that he wanted to be closer to Rome to put more pressure. Sicily had already undergone some sort of crisis, and so Naples was perfect, and at this point began to expand to become literally the largest city in Europe by the 1700s. Robert's governmental structure separated high policy from quotidian administration, with royal secretaries facilitating the king's direct exercise of authority, unencumbered by procedural delays. There was a lot of exceptionalism in any medieval kingdom, but again, the incredibly sort of hypertrophic southern Italian hinterland was, again, like a massive chthonic monster you had to connect. Unfortunately, we're not so well documented about southern Italy as much as we're for the center, for the north, because, again, a big feudal agricultural kingdom is very different from the highly sort of practically industrialized for the era standards, sort of pretty tidy central northern Italian city-states are also pretty much homogeneously developing, regardless of the fact that they are virtually independent. However, again, this kingdom was very rich. Actually, southern Italy still had communes, right? As we've seen also in the rest of Europe, the organizational forms were really the same. But we don't have the same political participation, for example, whereby, I don't know, a chronicler would simply write about local affairs in the same direct participative way you could see, for example, in Villani or Musatus. There are some southern Italian chronicles. At some point we'll talk a bit more about sources as well, and they mostly detail, in any case, the sort of main military expeditions and so on, but revealing also the centrality of especially those Sicilian expeditions, right? But this is the problem. Like, I will have at some point to make a massive video trying to explain how the Neapolitan kingdom actually worked in an institutional, administrative, social term. But let's put it in this way: the persistent structural challenges, such as, for example, a scarcity of qualified officials, at least they could be uniformly applied to this whole territory, because of the sheer geographic expanse of the dominions, entrenched personal loyalties, noble unrest. The barons controlled the hinterland. That's how, in any case, the same Angevins had installed themselves there, like brokering power with the barons. We've seen it also for the later Aragonese. Like, you can say it's the birth of mafia as we understand it, because that's sort of a very different thing. But the idea that there is something private about the management of the hinterland, it's a bit like we see in oligarchies. We've seen it countless times. For example, the failed elective monarchies of Central Europe. They all worked in more dysfunctional ways, and this place, if anything, was much richer and much more urbanized, so things could work even with a certain degree of administrative acuity. Important centers of juridical productions in universities, central offices, and so on. But controlling it was like trying to control an hydra, right? This really necessitated strategic delegation, meaning that you had to send probably an entire court with their own knightly retinues to, just like Taranto was, or the Duchy of Calabria. Even though they're, again, very close, but again, there are so many resources locally that they can self-perpetuate themselves as sort of autonomous things, which is actually still a good thing. Queen Sancha was delegated with part of the administration of domestic affairs. The young Charles of Calabria was appointed Vicar General in 1309 at age 11. He soon functioned as co-sovereign, embodying the regime's virtues. That's why also his passing was so devastating. Charles, as we said before, died prematurely on November the 9th, 1328, from plague. Decapitating this dual structure, as far as also the control of Calabria, for example, was concerned, and precipitating a profound political and moral crisis that demanded urgent reorganization amidst also the fatherly pain, as you can imagine. Robert adeptly integrated diverse elites into governance. The Duke of Calabria was a cool guy, by the way. He was a successful commander. He showed that in Tuscany. Like, again, the knightly tradition of these French rulers lived in, also with the local Neapolitan one and so on. So, again, very heavy blow for the Angevin house. Robert adeptly integrated diverse elites into governance. The native so-called renicoli, that is to say the subjects of the kingdoms, of the de facto the native Italian, even though many of the noblemen were, as you know, Norman, Swabian, Angevin descent, they were de facto Italianized, dominating the high offices. While Tuscan merchants and bankers, these are really key, especially Florentines, Florence was the richest city in the globe at the time, provided essential financial expertise and loans, intertwining Angevin fortunes with wealth communes. Right, the Tuscan power, the Tuscan brokers will essentially dominate, like administrate the Neapolitan kingdom by the time of Joanna. You know who she is, we will see it now. They were subcontracted the sort of enormous assets. The biggest deal with southern Italy, and that's why, by the way, that the marriage also with Tuscany, with Florence's big metropolis, was grain exports, right? Sicily historically had provided mostly that, but also southern Italy was full of agricultural resources. So the Florentines were also efficient in their commercial deals, were subcontracted the administration of these areas, and the attempt was sort of to strip the local administration, if any, from the local barons that were a bit more latifundistically minded, and so not so. They didn't have like the financially, like they didn't have really much to invest to modernize, so to say, to innovate. Really, the Florentines provided essential financial expertise and loans. They were the most advanced bankers of the year. Privileges and dialogues with vassals, universities, and urban patriciates, particularly the rising Neapolitan bourgeoisie, fostered inclusion. His brother John of Gravina, Duke of Durazzo, died in 1336, and Philip of Taranto, Prince, in fact, of Taranto and Achaia, died in 1331. So their appanages vastly expanded, exemplifying centrifugal noble ambitions that Robert balanced through cooptation rather than confrontation. There was such a large amount of resources, it was useless also to go at war with one another within the system. Something unthinkable, by the way, in many other realms. The close alliance with the Avignon papacy that stayed in southern France willingly, by the way, and not at all under any French imposition, as it's sometimes said, between 1309 and 1377, formed the bedrock of Robert's foreign policy, as we've seen before. His sojourns in Provence, first in 1309-1310, and extensively from 1319 to 1324, allowed intimate coordination with Pope John XXII. Imagine these meetings, by the way, what they could have discussed, also the clashes, the war against Milan and more. The former, Pope John XXII had been an Angevin chancellor before being elected in 1316. Right, that was the idea of transforming the Pope Valley in a great papal state, fundamentally ruled by local vicar, right, Bertrand de Pouget, other key figure there, and they almost succeeded, by the way, because Milan almost fell. It was just like the tip of the balance. Some German mercenaries who decided to stick with the Visconti after having initially changed side, because they understood that the French would have put them out of work. Right? Now, this partnership yielded immense ideological dividends, sanctifying Angevin interventions as papal crusades, and practical ones, of course, including lucrative ecclesiastical revenues. In Italy, Robert's authority peaked. Appointed as papal rector of Romagna, the papal province in northeastern Italy, from 1310 to 1318, he seized and held Ferrara, the Este city on the Po branches of its delta, from 1312 to 1317 against the Este family and Venetian ambitions as well. Here we're mostly talking again about Angevin Neapolitan troops sent to the north, but everything was directed by him. So again, you want to appreciate even the strategic vision of this man, because as we'll learn later, Robert passes a bit as the, too peaceful, too spiritual. It's mostly also Dante's, because of Dante's fault, it wanted to stress this more idea of, action-based, Ghibelline, traditional ethos, whereas, there was something bigger at play there. The Este lordship came back in any case in fact, Este family. This was a branch of the old Welfen house, and it descended from the Franks, right? It was that old and that imperially connected, by the way. In part, that's also why the Angevins attacked it. We'll talk about the Este as well. Again, it's unbelievable to be in 2025 and not seeing this content around, like properly having like the realization that today's sort of culture does not, like, you can see, I don't know, something is discussed but is sort of, secondarily dealt with, like probably the complete absence of literally anything. I'm discovering that I am the only person making videos about certain topics that I thought to be big, like in the Battle of Tagliacozzo. Like, I was literally the first person to make in how many years of YouTube and how many, I don't know, billions of videos. Like, I'm literally the only person. How is it even possible, right? This is weird, and it sort of shows you like the complete moral, personal, and cultural bankruptcy of, today's average person. It's impossible to live, in my opinion, in a world without having properly the fundamentals of medieval European history, right? Anyhow, there is lots of interesting warfare. The Venetians also landing in near Ferrara to... before I said confused Este with Ferrara. I mean, Ferrara is the center. Este was through a city further north that also belonged to the to other communes, but that's also what the dynasty actually was connected with, was actually Ferrara. Robert in all this was imperial vicar for all Italian imperial lands from 1340 to 1343. We said it before, because in practice he had to be the alter ego of the emperor, who also, Henry VII literally declared, wanted simply to decapitate King Robert because they had usurped the Swabian legacy. The Pope conferred this title with minor limitations, because obviously the king, it's not like they were lording over Italy. They were simply being tasked with certain missions, and the papacy had to green light that. It was mostly the papacy that even had direct territorial ambitions, as we said before, in northern Italy in particular. Robert also served as senator of Rome in 2 terms. This was essentially like a leader of Rome for a while, but there was the papacy there, and so everything was shared. Like the Roman commune, accepted him. We're talking 1313 to 1315, which was also, as we'll see, the height of not of the imperial, but especially of the Ghibelline pressure. Also 1317 to 1335 was sort of a mean of greater stabilization. Robert accepted the lordship of Florence, leading the Guelph commune from 1313 to 1321. He governed Genoa, where he was almost killed by the Ghibellines in that enormous siege. He personally fought on his walls to repel Ghibelline assault. Genoa was very crucial because it was essentially the only major Guelph naval power that could assist the Neapolitans. I made a video about medieval Genoa. He formally, because these titles again were just formal, like I said, you have the lordship of King Robert here. He ruled from Naples. He was out of Provence, etc. But so he mostly sent troops, right? That was normally the mechanism. You have Brescia, Lombard city in 1319. Under Robert Asti, the Piedmontese city that I also made a video on was annexed to Angevin Piedmont, the one ruled by the Seneschal of Provence from 1312 to 1342. This happened mostly because of the exhaustion of the commune in the wars against actually lots of different factions. There are all the relations with Savoy, with the Visconti. It's incredibly complicated. There are so many different factions, lordships locally, especially in Piedmont, that is very fragmented. In Piedmont, however, at that point, he managed to impose direct rule because, at least not uniformly, because there were many different communes, but Asti was the bigger one. And for a long time, just a good, 20, 30 years, he managed essentially to maintain the Angevin control of those areas. It wasn't really, even in that case, a point of expansion. There were some expeditions against Milan, but they weren't really, by the Angevins, the Guelph Lombards, but they weren't so pernicious like the expedition of Bertrand de Pouget, the crusade against Milan, orchestrated by the papal legate with an astronomical amount of money. We're talking about millions of florins spent in a single year. for that campaign. That tells you also how much wealth like the papacy had alone by itself. If anything, it was mostly to maintain. Military expenses were incredibly high, and that's also the ultimate reason why the system was never really too aggressive. Where the Welfs, with the Angevins mostly intervened, was Tuscany, because it was too important and too dynamic. There were more developed powers than, say, in Piedmont. Even the Visconti at some point tried mostly to attack Genoa as opposed to Piedmont, but there were skirmishes and so on, and those places relied on the Angevin pace, right? In fact, also elsewhere, a more measured approach prevailed. This expansion model, in fact, blended seigneurial control with the monarchy's anti-tyrannical wealth vocation, which may sound like a paradox, because I made an entire video explaining how, weirdly enough, like the Italian lords were called tyrants or despots in some historiography, but they were actually the single most republican powers in Europe. So, if those were tyrants, what were monarchs really? However, it is also true that the Angevins had a very measured approach, as we've seen in Italia, to properly the control of the Italian communes. The Welfs were among the least, in fact, tolerant to any sort of autocratic imposition. And so when even Robert or his ancestors had been lords, say places like Florence, again, it was mostly in the traditional sense of rule, not much trying to impose themselves, creating a super state of Angevin direct control at all. All right, it was not really needed. Everything flowed smoothly. And if anything, there was a rhetoric against the Visconti and the other Ghibelline lords that were co-opted as imperial vicars by the emperor, as we will see now. So, in a way, the Angevins were Italy's paramount power and bulwark against Ghibelline lords, mostly as a tip of the balance, though, because the resources of the Guelph Alliance in central and northern Italy were also pretty big on their own, right? The Ghibellines were mostly backed by the sort of various imperial claimants, also Bohemian interlopers, because there is that parenthesis of the Luxembourgs after Henry VII with his son John of Bohemia and the young Charles IV, whose reign we have also looked at. He sort of fought in Italy at this point, later in the 30s and the 40s. But the most important event, definitely, that shattered a bit this order was not even a bit, really, the descent of Emperor Henry VII. He was, as you know, emperor, or at least king of Germany from 1308, then I think king of the Romans in 1309, and emperor in 1312, then he died in 1313. He didn't enjoy that much, but changed a big deal. Henry VII, we should really make a biographic video about him, because he is enormous. And he changed way more than what it's conventionally believed. He, as you know, had his home fought in Italy from 1310 to 1313. And in a sense, it crystallized Robert's role as champion of the Guelph cause, but more concretely, he actually realigned in almost the entirety of northern Italy under a Ghibelline pro-imperial cause, fostering the rise to power of the Visconti, the La Scala. Initially equivocal toward Henry's papal-blessed mission to restore peace, Robert committed to open hostility by 1312. The papacy at some point almost brokered a secret deal with Henry VII that was really very straightforwardly saying he tried to have a hieratic kind of appearance, a bit like Philip IV, and the same Robert in the model of perennial sort of sovereign of the era, especially Holy Roman Emperor. But he really hated the Angevins. Robert shrewdly delegated the brunt of combat to Florentine allies by that point, which was the most sort of intelligent thing to do, also because basically the Guelphs shut themselves into their cities, and yes, there were some confrontations in open field, but there was never a major pitched battle, which is rare because actually the Italians were fighting also with their German and French knights pretty big battles, and we will see it especially later. But Henry at that point was concentrating together with his Lorrainese troops and the the Germans and the Ghibelline Italians, really an unprecedented power that could be replenished. The Aragonese helped him as well, even though lots of losses were taken. Henry excommunicated Robert, just out of his imperial volition, forged an alliance with Frederick III of Sicily in 1312, and issued a formal ban condemning him to death, literally, on April 26, 1313. Robert dispatched his brother John of Gravina with 400 knights to block Henry's entry into Rome in 1312. That witnessed actually the largest urban battle in medieval warfare. He also boycotted the imperial diet at Pisa, the Tuscan city, further provoking the emperor. Henry's sudden death from malaria at Buonconvento near Siena on August 24, 1313, transformed Robert into the hailed, quote, Good Robert, King of an Italic reign, as it was called. All right. The military operations of Henry's Raumfahrt are very interesting. The idea is that after the plague that had killed part of his family, also, the siege of Brescia that had broken out, and also Valoran, the emperor's brother, had been killed by a quarrel thrown by the Guelphs from the walls. They failed, especially the battle in Rome that basically brought him to be crowned in St. John Lateran rather than in St. Peter, because half of the city was held by the Guelphs and the other by the Ghibellines. The failed siege of Florence and sort of the inconclusive campaign in Chianti between 1312 1313 brought him to basically replenish his entire army with great also Aragonese money and so on, showing actually he was very powerful at that point. Before his death in Buonconvento, he was literally marching towards Naples. And at that point, actually, the Angevins did not have enough means ready to stop him. And hadn't he died, he may have actually reconquered southern Italy, which is absolutely not outside of the possibility. People say, oh no, after 1268 everything was lost, the Germans could not. This is really not true. If you really study the operations and if you don't indulge into the defeatism that we're notionistically repeating because of Dante, right? What was most threatening, and also for the Guelph cause at least, and also heavy for the Angevins, was the ensuing Guelph, or better, Ghibelline continuity of power. Like there was an attempt, of course, of the Guelphs after the emperor died in the same 1313 that brought to some big raids up to the outskirts of Milan, guided by Hugues de Beau, that was sort of one of the provincial commanders of Robert. Target northern Ghibelline leaders like Matteo Visconti, the Lord of Milan, also Count Grande della Scala, one of Verona. Yet again, it's the Ghibelline counterattack that creates this Guelph disasters, because the Ghibellines basically hired those Germans who were coming back north after the end of the Raumfahrt and used them as their own knights. There's the catastrophic rout at Montecatini, fought on August the 29th, 1315, in the Nievole Valley in Tuscany. Here, Philip of Taranto, commanding the Angevin contingent, failed badly. He was ill during the command, and the battle is very interesting. Nobody knows even what it was about and why it's the most important of the era, possibly the largest battle in Western Europe, like during the Middle Ages. Incredibly tactically complex and sort of intense, resulting, painfully enough, for the House of Naples in the deaths of Robert's brother Peter, the Count of Eboli, and the nephew Charles of Achaia, the son of Philip himself. Right? This was a real insult. Also because literally the Ghibellines fighting there, including the Germans, were all, the head of a flag with the head of Conradin, the severed head on Conradin. They really still hated the Angevins. They really wanted to kill them. There was really this deeply seated hatred against the descendants of Charles of Anjou. There was also the Ferrara Revolt in August 1317, where the Anjou and better Catalan were massacred, restoring Este control. Like properly, the Ferrarese people were massacred, the Angevin garrison. The election of Pope John the 22nd in 1316, as we've seen, inaugurates a decade of close collaboration armed at Sicilian reconquest and dynastic security. All those Ghibelline victories in the north were something, but in Tuscany, in any case, even after Montecatini, the Ghibellines could not make headway. Again, it's always the same story. Florence plus Angevin forces gets the best army, sort of the bigger one, gets destroyed. But sort of there is a sudden crisis, but the Ghibellines from Lucca and Pisa do not really have the means to, even with coalesced forces, like in the case of Montecatini and later Alta Pasha, to push on Florence and having it fall. So everything is juggled, balanced. It's a very intense moment of phase of warfare. This is a bit like the peak, right? Then the Angevins are a bit shrewder. Later they target mostly castles, sort of command operations, to retake specific central point for the Florentines. Robert's extended Avignon residence from 1319 to 1324 facilitated ambitious plotting for Italian hegemony. Returning to Naples in June 1324, he dispatched a massive fleet against Sicily on May 26, 1325, but it achieved nothing. This was just one of the many attempts. By the way, we're not even looking at them specifically because we could make easily a series about, I don't know, Robert's reign, sort of military activity in a way. Meanwhile, the Florentine Guelphs under his son Charles suffered a bloody defeat at Alto Pasha. Meanwhile, 10 years after Montecatini. It was a Lucchese battle fought on September 23rd, 1325, in fact, and a Ghibelline victory at the hands of Castruccio Castracani, the Ghibelline condottiere and lord of Lucca. He had an enormous experience. He had been also favorite of Edward the First of England. He had served the French, apparently also in Flanders, against the Flemish, the Lombard, Tuscan contractors. Had made marvels there at the hand. That's paid by some very interesting figures, the Scotti, Musciato Francesi. All these were contractors tied to the French Neapolitan Tuscan financial military system. Incredible times, incredible figures. Charles accepted the lordship of Florence in 1325, but withdrew amid protests following the descent of Emperor Louis the Bavarian. That I also made a video on a couple of months ago. He was Wittelsbach Emperor, as you know, from 1314 to 1347. Quite interesting figure that incarnates this imperial withdrawal from sort of the Mediterranean theater to Germany. He was very shrewd. He may carry out this expedition in 1327, 1330 that just obtains him the imperial crown. He sort of pillages different places, ransoms, them in exchange for a lot, including allies, the Visconti. It was a very dark period. It really makes you understand how everything in a few decades had collapsed, even just out of these immense military expenses, but these immense armies that had been mobilized, especially by the Guelphs, paid in part by the Angevins. So at that point, the risk was also minimal in terms of actual conquest. Like Henry VII was really threatening, Ludwig of Wittelsbach really not. Robert adopted a defensive posture, which made sense in the general picture. They were still thinking about reconquering Sicily, and they didn't want to invest themselves too much in central northern Italy, especially as the same Florentines were gradually emancipating themselves from the Neapolitan protection. This really corresponds to the shrinking of the great universal powers towards the crisis of the mid-14th century. So everything regionalizes. We'll see at the end what it means. Also for southern Italy. Then up to Robert's reign, it was sort of a dynamic part of sort of Italy, and it would remain that, but it was also sort of finally sort of enucleated in the modern sense of probably a linguistic, cultural barrier, ethno-social ensemble, so to say. It was already very different in a way, but it was, you see, with the Angevins here, sort of fully connected with the rest in even through its sort of different characteristics. The Bolognese Guelphs were crushed at Zappolino in the same 1325 on November the 15th, while in Alto Pascio in Tuscany the same year there had been Provençal forces. Zappolino was basically some now thing on its own, right? It paradoxically even facilitated the installation of Bertrand de Pouget as papal vicar in the north, and at that point the Angevins, you understand, were not there anymore. They were still in Piedmont because, again, of the closeness, the contiguity, territorial continuity also with Provence. But also the connections with Tuscany were gradually fading away. The renewed Sicilian Wars from 1314 onward, because when also Henry VII had descended, the Aragonese had begun to launch raids across the entire Tyrrhenian coast. We're talking 8 major expeditions spanning 1314 to 1343 inflicted constant pressure on Frederick III of Sicily, forcing him onto the defensive but yielding no territorial gains due to the Aragonese naval supremacy. When you look at this, you realize how actually military active the Kingdom of Naples was under Robert. So when Dante sort of complains, or at least mocks Robert, was saying, he didn't intervene that much, look at this way. He was thinking mostly in a central northern Italian perspective. But if you really think at it from a Neapolitan one, you realize that Sicily was by far the most important strategic objective to reconquer entirely. And 8 massive expeditions with tens of thousands of men each. Like, when you say again, military power was modest in the Middle Ages, there were few forces, but I made an entire video showing how big this stuff was in the 70 years, let's say from 1289 to, 13, or even 60 years, to the mid-14th century. In Italy, there were at least something like 70 documented armies with at least 10,000 men in them. And so it's something insane and immense. It tells you that basically an incredibly large amount of people, considering also all the minor forces, we're talking in the millions, right, of men under arms, which is, again, revealing how rich these places were, how belligerent, bellicose they were. In the meanwhile, Robert also consolidated Provence's borders, maintained his protectorate over Majorca, drew the Dauphin Humbert II, the last independent Dauphin of Viennois, meaning not the heir to the French throne, but I made a video about the Dauphiné, explaining what that had come about, at this point, to be eventually to become a failed state and being later absorbed by the French. That came in fact into the same Angevin orbit from Provence itself. Also, Robert restored the Achaean rights to the Taranto and Durazzo Cadet branches in all of this, securing a bit like the Aegean theater as well. That is interesting, but he was not so active like his ancestors had been, because the West was objectively more important. Robert's final Sicilian attempt in 1332 ended in abortive failure, even. Charles of Calabria's death in 1328 precipitated a dire succession crisis. Robert designated his granddaughters Joanna, future Queen of Joanna I, reigning from 1343 to 1382, born in 1326, and Mary, born posthumously in 1329, as heirs, securing recognition from subjects and brothers in 1330, 1331. This was the greatest problem after the death of Duke of Calabria. To reconcile the Neapolitan and Hungarian Angevin branches, Robert betrothed Joanna to Andrew, son of Charles I of Hungary, the Calabertian line, where in 1333 both were raised at the Neapolitan court and married immediately after Robert's death. Because in the meanwhile, as you know, the Hungarians were not particularly, eager to have a strong monarch. Of course, they had let the guy sort of live in Naples, at the Angevin court there. In any case, this I remember the Hungarian resentments over the 1309 usurpation. The fact that Joanna was favored revived them. Robert overrode his brother Philip's claims to Provence and Piedmont under Charles II's will. His testament, dictated on January 16, 1343 at Castelnuovo in Naples, confirmed Joanna as universal heir, with Andrew essentially as just a mere consort and prince of Salerno. So even with a relatively scarce appanage, as well as with Sancha as regent, so the manor, pointedly omitting the papacy's feudal right of tutelage during Joanna's minority. So everything was planned essentially to sort of give to her this enormous privilege and honor and burden at the same time to reign, especially after such a great ruler like Robert. The later phase of Robert's reign is painful because there is a visible contraction of power in amidst sort of general collapse of even certain positions in the frontier areas. This is really typical of every power here. You can see how degrading, for example, progressively were Henry VII, Ludwig of Bavaria, and John of Bohemia expeditions into Italy were always smaller and ever more dependent on the local allies. Military engagements persisted in any case into the final years. We're approaching the year of the sort of mercenary companies, sort of that disastrous situation we've seen also recently with some condottieri, especially we talk about Braccio later, but in 1341, Robert intervened in the disputed Margraviate of Saluzzo. That was one of the Piedmontese lordships in that complicated political scenario, supporting Manfred V against his Ghibelline nephew Thomas II. Different branches quarreling with one another. Thomas was allied to the Visconti, by the way, and so there was a very deep implication, struggle over this important, by the way, imperial feudal reality, because this area was sort of less communal compared to the existence of this more nobiliar subalpine dominions. Now, the Angevin forces were involved, besieging, sacking, and burning the same Saluzzo, ransoming Thomas at that point. However, the defeat of the Viscera Reforza d'Anjou at the Battle of Gamenario, this was a Piedmontese battle fought at April the 22nd, 1342, signaled the beginning of Angevin decline in Piedmont. Right, that's a very important battle, and there are Montferrand forces. We will, if anything, make a video about that. We don't know so much, but there are very interesting patterns, some things that had happened also in the better documented Alto Pascio, Montecatini, where there are much more sort of chivalric clashes, but the infantry had quite strong relevance, as always, in Italian affairs. And that clash essentially marked the end of at least the decline of the Angevins in Piedmont. Asti passed to the Visconti, importantly enough. So this was it's a bit of a disastrous situation. Also, against John of Bohemia's expansionist forays in northern Italy from 1330 to 1333, this was the son of Henry VII. He would die, famously enough, as blind at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Robert's League compelled his withdrawal. Something very bizarre was happening there, where John of Bohemia allied itself with the papal legate, and the Angevins paradoxically found some common ground with the Ghibelline lords who appealed to him for aid, because it seemed like, you understand how messed up that is, because in theory, like Charles had to be the next sort of Germanic ruler, right? Charles, I keep saying Charles, but it's John plus Charles, because Charles was actually there, and John, in his errant, shenanigans across Europe, sort of left at some point for France, and Charles, the future Charles IV, kept fighting in Italy. But the sense was that the papacy and these guys were trying to find weird connections. That tells you how sort of the Guelph-Ghibelline dichotomy had somehow collapsed, and even the Ghibellines at some point appealed to Robert, but in a completely disgregational situation where the actual reach of this power was basically collapsing, like something unthinkable even just 20 years before. But it gives you a deep sense of the collapse of the entire medieval civilization at this point. By the 1330s, pragmatic disengagement defined policy. Papal autonomy grew. There's John the 22nd's complicity in Bohemia's 1330 campaign, which underscores also this weird relation now with Avignon. Italian communes voicing scorn for Robert's perceived avarice and timidity. Chiefly the Florentines, who basically started hiring French soldiers on their own, right? French knights, impoverished aristocrats who wanted to come to Florence to be mercenaries, also starting to hire Germans. They were too Ghibelline up to that point to be hired. And so essentially being on their own and saying that we don't want to have any Neapolitan anymore. And this underscores like the collapse of that ideal of the wealth, a big wealth alliance, in a world that was losing its sort of traditional compass from both sides. The Visconti are rising steadily as Milanese lords ever more better entrenched. The Angevin sway is eroded and fragmented by all this. So it's difficult even to picture this without further context, because you would really need to know the history of all the various cases. But let's say that no permanent supracommunal institutions were ever imposed beyond the Doc military leagues, right? The Italia was basically just this financial participation, keeping some soldiers ready for hire and service. Now, domestic priorities dominated, if you look at this from a Neapolitan perspective. The Sicilian drain diverted Mediterranean ambitions away also from the east. The Neapolitan nobility rectitude and brigandage were quelled through concessions rather than enforcement, which is typical of, again, the oligarchization of this land, and as it's a bit typical also for the later Middle Ages in many kingdoms. There were some financial reforms clearing the feudal census owed to the Holy See between 1330 and 1340, which achieved, however, this rare solvency. Robert died on January the 20th, 1343, at Castelnuovo, age 64, after a very intense life, after a reign of transformative depth, really. And you have this somber sort of situation all around that matches with the funereal atmosphere. Dressed in a Franciscan habit, Robert was interred in St. Clair. Obsequies extended from January the 21st to February the 3rd, 1343. A great man passed at that point, and Europe sort of stopped for a moment because of what he had embodied, what kind of figure, even just among his enemies, again, who is in charge of all this, it's King Robert, right? Even more than France. The French partially intervened in Italy, but it was not really normal or habitual, but the future King of France at some point tried to attack Milan. As soon as the Milanese army showed up, the French stopped, and the guy coming back to France said, "Oh my God, the Italians have this." It's very funny. It's an incident in which also there is villainy states, but there is also another Piedmontese author who says that there was the snail, right? The French misunderstood the Visconti viper for a snail, and so there was this mockery that the French had been beaten by the snail, which was also a reference to the fact that the Lombards were understood as the snail in the Carolingian tradition, a bit like entering the city walls and not coming out when the Carolingians invaded back in Longobard times. So it's weird because it flipped the notion that, again, the Italians would have been militarily inferior to the French. So there is a lot of stuff really going on in here. It's such a dense period. The grandiose Gothic tomb commissioned by Sancho and sculpted by Giovanni and Pacio Bertini between 1343 and 1346 depicts the enthroned Robert atop his shrouded corpse, embodying the fusion of regal authority and pious renunciation that had really characterized the king's spirituality. And just imagine how much Europe had changed, what it meant to have, I don't know, Charles the First of Anjou as your ancestor, and having dealt with European affairs in this way, in this time of questions, of pain, of decline. It's quite romantic and fascinating, even on the backdrop of this beautiful southern Italian landscapes, coasts, famous landmarks. The Basques, like the Angevins, had this old sort of Roman habit, like in some of the areas of the Campania Felix, to enjoy it. There was an idea of spiritual but also luxurious contrast in this world. We will look more at the Angevin court of Naples because it's quite fascinating. There were so many different famous figures that were made there. Andrew of Hungary's subsequent claims immediately tested the testament of Robert, igniting the crisis of Joanna I's reign that ultimately doomed the Angevin dynasty in Naples. Robert's legacy endures as the architect of Angevin Naples' zenith. Tuscan merchants transmuted debatably squalid port at that point, but it was not far from that. It was big in any case already, into a city of medieval splendor, right, erecting monuments, statues, and palaces. The University of Naples drew students from across Italy, flourishing under royal patronage. Wealth economic ties boomed commerce and finance. Though Sicilian reconquest eluded Robert and dynastic woes shadowed his close, Robert's administrative acumen, cultural munificence, and relative peace consolidated a robust mainland realm, bequeathing to Joanna a foundation of stability amid the ruins of overreaching ambition, a testament to the wise king's enduring print on medieval Europe. With Robert's death, the divide between the sort of the Italic kingdom and the Neapolitan one sharpened, right? The Tronto and Garigliano rivers will mark this very important watershed in probably cultural divide between central, northern, and southern Italy. The former went probably a different direction, and southern Italy remained also with we're talking southern Italy, even though it's mostly just the southern Italian mainland, but in a sense, like similar dynamic, also connected with previous mechanisms, but mostly the crumbling of a unitary kingdom of Sicily are to be witnessed to also in Sicily, in Sardinia. So there is, again, a world that ended in ways that are sort of difficult to explain, and that only more videos about medieval southern Italy can really better explain, right? We have never really done too much about southern Italy, especially. I think the only original series stuff that we made was about medieval Sicily and Amalfi, yeah, because that was a single city. But for example, here we see, medieval Sicily, 30 videos? How is it possible? I thought it made much less than that. And so southern Italy, probably even more. Yeah, because I distinguish Sicily from southern Italy. Well, this may be something, but it's confusing. I should add the Sicilian thing. Or I should say, well, it sort of kind of makes sense if you think about it, but I don't know. I'll see how to title them better. So they probably also overlap in part. So it's probably less videos, in fact, than I really thought. And or actually, I mean, what I expected, but I mean, not as many as I could be surprised by. So this is fundamentally the game. This is fundamentally the picture of King Robert. I managed to cover this in relatively few in a single episode. But remember, this stuff is important. I am honestly disappointed when I see that I make videos about certain topics. It might not be this one. I don't know how many views this video will get, but for example, yesterday's one about the Sasanian Heptalite Wars. I mean, that's actually a pretty good video. nobody that I'm aware of really made. Probably, maybe they did that, but not Tagliacozzo. Let's make me a search for that. Have the lights and Sicilian. Predictably, like Kings and Generals did something, but not quite these wars in particular, and I'm the only one to have really made effective video about the wars as such, because it's a proper military history. That the other guys, it's mostly just about the afterlives in general. It is also a fairly old video, by the way, so it's interesting as much as it's sort of, again, you see, they make the more research stuff, and they are also the only ones here, but they don't fundamentally treat the single most important battles in the West. It's very weird about the channel. I don't know why they do that, but they're trying to fish some sort of views in exoticism, while the most important topics here are not watched. Like the video about Frederick II of Babenberg. That's a big video, like, or at least maybe not big in that sense, but to say it's important. Like, why wouldn't anyone care about this stuff? It's sort of weird, really, that only when, I don't know, make certain topics people watch, when there is drama, where there is answers, whatever, commentaries, people watch. It's like so, I don't know, provincial. It's so weird. It's so, I don't know, unambitious, and unfortunately, so YouTube is. And let me check if someone made a video about King Robert. Probably. No one. Obviously enough. Ridiculous. Really ridiculous. This is what I'm talking about. Well, no, there is one. Well, okay, but it lasts like 4 minutes. There is really no major video about him. Well, let's hope this works, at least. Very well, however, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.